What do you think of when you think of Jesus of Nazareth? Do you think about a holy man? Do you think about a miracle man? Do you think about a superhero? Is that how Jesus of Nazareth is presented to us, to history, by the people who have crafted together and collected accounts of his life and his death and his resurrection? There are 4 of those accounts in a collection of material that we call the Gospels. 4 books that collect together materials from the first century about this Jesus of Nazareth. And what does he say about himself, or what do other people say about him? Do they call him a holy man? Do they call him a miracle man? Do they make him out to be a superhero? Well, no, those of us who've wrestled with these stories don't find that. Instead, here in particular, in a book called Luke, we find a man acting like a teacher, acting like someone who is living out something he calls the kingdom. It's like a project, a movement. And what kind of project? Well, a project that he claims his God has always been involved in. It's been a huge part of what's known as the Jewish story. A project that started with a creation poem and ends actually with a set of visions and songs about a creation that is put back together, that is renewed. And this whole thing seems to hinge somehow around this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And in the accounts of his life, Jesus of Nazareth, when he speaks about bringing something called good news. But that good news is specific or targeted at, he says, the poor, the outcasts, the prisoners, the weary, the oppressed. Is it good news from a holy man? Is it good news to have a miracle man? Is it good news to know about a superhero? Well, at the point we are together at in Luke's account, in chapter 8, what we find is a Jewish leader, and at this point, the Jewish leaders in the ancient Near East seem to be pretty suspicious of the kinds of things he's doing. We find this Jewish leader throwing himself down at Jesus' feet and begging him for help. He wants Jesus to come to his house because this man's only daughter, age 12, is dying. Now Luke, like any Jewish writer, includes all of these details for a reason. This is his only daughter. She's age 12 and she is dying. And somehow this man thinks that Jesus of Nazareth can somehow help in this situation. Then, because Luke is an artist, he's a storyteller, he pauses his action and he tells about another woman. And this time a woman who's been suffering with bleeding, a bleeding condition, and she's suffered for 12 years. No one's been able to heal her for 12 years. We've got a young girl who's 12 years old, and we've got a woman who's been suffering for 12 years. It's not an accident. Luke wants to put these stories together. He is an artist drawing things out. Now he takes a pause and makes us wait to see what's happening to this dying Jewish girl. So let's pause ourselves and think for a minute about a first century Jewish community. This girl is dying. According to Jewish customs in the Jewish scriptures, anything connected to death, connected to dead bodies, is something that you avoid. It makes you ritually unclean, not able to take part in worship for a while. And according to those very same rituals and customs, anything connected to illnesses, especially those about skin conditions or about bleeding, particularly connected to women, makes anyone who comes into contact with those people, again, ritually unclean, unable to be part of what is happening in the synagogue, in the community life. This woman has been ill with something that would keep her away from everybody else for 12 years. She's been an outsider from the worship, from her family, from society, for the whole time. The woman believes, and the word that's used in here is trust or faith, that this man somehow can help. She trusts that somehow there's a power connected to Jesus. And so she pushes through the crowd and she touches the edge of what would have been his prayer shawl over his shoulder. Immediately her bleeding stops. She was right to put her trust in this man. But there's more to the story because Jesus doesn't leave it there. He knows that something has happened, but he doesn't know how or who is involved. And I actually love that detail in the story because it tells me that Jesus wasn't a superhero. That Jesus was a human being like the rest of us. Not a super holy man, or a show-off miracle man, or a superhero who could do everything and knew everything. Instead, what Luke shows, and the other accounts are the same, is someone who doesn't know everything. Who, in the moment, knows that something has happened but doesn't know who has been involved. He's fully human. And I love that. Peter, one of his followers, one of his disciples, tells him not to be so daft and try and work this out because it's a huge crowd and how could they possibly work out who has touched him? But this idea of contact is important. Because as I said, contact with someone who's been bleeding would have made a Jewish man ritually unclean. This woman's taken a huge risk touching even the cloak of a Jewish teacher. But Jesus wants to identify the woman and wants to allow her to speak, to make what's happened in secret public, to put on show, which again is what he said he's been doing, what God is doing. The point is not how holy Jesus is. The point is not how much power Jesus has, how many miracles he can perform. The point is what God is doing. The point is that healing, restoring, putting things back together, bringing someone who is sick, who is outcast, who's excluded, into the community. Good news, as Jesus said, for the poor and the outcast. And this woman who's been excluded for so long, she gets to tell her story. She gets to have a voice and then to return to her home, to her family, to her community, to be part of what she was made for. But what about the dying girl? Jesus has dandered around so long here with this woman that the girl has died. This is a tragedy. If this woman hadn't interrupted him, maybe things would be different in that case. Isn't it interesting that in these stories, interruptions are so often where the most significant things happen or are revealed? How many times in my life have I wanted to skip past all the interruptions in life to get to the important bits? How many times have I been forced into, or felt forced into, or pressured into trying to do too many things, deal with too many people all at the same time, keeping plates spinning? Instead, Jesus seems to have time for the person in front of him, to be present, to deal with one thing, one person, one at a time, and in their own time fully. Jesus says to them who are wailing, who are panicking, his most often repeated command: do not be afraid. Instead, he encourages him to trust. That's what the words believe or faith in these stories mean, to trust that she will be healed. He says something curious. He says the girl's just asleep. Now, some people might think, well, maybe she just fainted. Maybe she's in some sort of coma that they didn't understand, and then Jesus rouses her out of it. But that's not what's going on here. This phrase for being asleep as a phrase for actual death was a really common one in the ancient Jewish world. And of course, their reaction means they knew as well that she was actually physically dead. However, maybe Jesus was hinting that for him, for God, this is only a temporary situation. Jesus then takes the girl by the hand. And I might think the amazing thing is that she comes back to life, but don't miss that detail. Remember, dead bodies make Jewish men ritually unclean. No one willingly enters a room with a corpse or touches a dead body, but Jesus does. And this is one of Luke's big themes, that Jesus, doing God's work, putting what God does on show, being part of the power that God gets involved into these situations, gets his hands dirty all the time. And instead of him ending up polluted somehow, the opposite seems to happen, that Jesus brings healing. He gets rid of everything that gets in the way, and the result is a girl in her family standing and eating with her family again, returned to live the life she was made for. This is what it seems to be all about for Luke. Life, healing, restoration, putting things back together. Good news for the poor and the outcasts, bringing families back together, including those who've been excluded, so that each one can then together play their part, join in, live the life they were made for, learning and following not a holy man, not a miracle man, not a superhero who we can't sympathise with, but a man whose life and death and resurrection in the bigger picture makes the opportunity to live the life we were all made for possible. A God, a man who gets his hands dirty, who wants to restore us, who wants to give us the opportunity to eat, who invites us to join him, to be around him, around a table with bread and wine.